Welcome, everybody. My name is Carolyn Dubé. I'm the Executive Director at Fertility Matters Canada, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here today. I see lots of people jumping on Facebook, lots of people joining on our Zoom line. We're here today with Sara Cohen, who is a fertility lawyer in Canada, and she's also the president of the Board of Directors for Fertility Matters. So she's well connected with the patient voice, and we're really going to learn a lot of things today. We've had some more recent changes to the surrogacy laws of Canada. So she's going to tell us everything that we need to know to make sure that we're doing it really well. Sara?
Thanks so much for having me today. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Just to be clear, what I'm going to be doing today is I'm giving you some tips about how to do surrogacy well in Canada. I've kept it a really casual presentation, and I welcome your questions. So if you want to ask some questions, I'm really free to chat and talk about it. This is a very casual forum, so don't feel intimidated. I'm happy to chat. I am going to kind of intersperse some of these tips with some legal information, because I figure why not? While you have me, you may as well get some of that information you're looking for, and hopefully that will help. So just give me a second to pull up my slides and we will begin. Can you see those, Carolyn?
I can.
Great. Okay, so like Carolyn said, my name is Sara Cohen. My practice is Fertility Law Canada. I'm pretty active on social media. You can follow me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Fertility Law. I'm very proud to be president of Fertility Matters Canada. I'm a huge supporter of this organization, or I wouldn't be president. Thank you so much to Fertility Matters Canada for having me here today. Anything I can ever do to help that organization, it's my pleasure. And please, if you aren't already following Fertility Matters Canada on social media, we would love to engage you with our awesome organization, whether it's volunteering or supporting or participating in any way. That would be fabulous. So please join us there. Okay, so my very first tip, it's going to sound really a little bit funny coming from a lawyer. My very first thing is you should consult with a lawyer very early on. And part of the reason you should consider consulting with a lawyer early on is most of us are not going to charge you even for that first consultation. So don't feel scared because you don't want to spend money in case you don't go through with surrogacy. You should still talk to a lawyer very early on in the process, because what you don't want to do is start going down the wrong path, make promises that you can't keep, do things wrong basically, and have to backtrack. Either have to completely backtrack or have a lot of bumps in your road that you wouldn't have had there if you had done it properly to begin with. There's a few other reasons I think you should speak with your lawyer really early on. And one of those reasons is that unlike almost everyone else in the process, so unlike your clinic that works for you but also works for the surrogate, and unlike if you work with a consultancy or an agency, they work for you, but they also work with a surrogate. If you work with a counselor, most of the counselors or many of the counselors might work for you, but they might also meet with a surrogate. At the end of the day, your lawyer is your advocate and only works for you. So they are really your trusted advisor who can walk you through this process. I've been doing this for 10 years, and it's the only area of work I do. So whether you work with me or another lawyer, please make sure you're talking to a fertility lawyer. So someone who has a lot of expertise in the area, not someone who mostly does real estate, not someone who mostly does commercial litigation, but someone who does a lot of the surrogacy work. Now, another reason you want to speak to a lawyer early on is some people are under the impression that the only time they need a lawyer is when they're drafting contracts. I think that's a really bad idea, because there's actually legal implications through surrogacy from the beginning to the end. So those begin with even, which province does a surrogacy live in? That really affects who's a parent. That affects finding and working with a surrogacy agency. Some of them are probably legitimate and some of them probably are not legally acceptable. So you need to figure that out early on, making sure the surrogate's the right age, there's an age requirement, etc. So from the very beginning, there are legal issues, and you need to be careful that you're not missing those early on in the process. So speak to your lawyer really early on. Now, I want you all to have a good sense of your legal implications involved in surrogacy before you get started, and some of those we've talked about. So working with a consultant is probably one of the questions I get the most often. Is it legal to work with a consultant? And the answer is very gray. Some of the consultants are perfectly legitimate and we think they're just fine under the law, and some aren't. So we can't give you this catch-all answer. And I think it's wrong to give people a catch-all answer. You should talk to your lawyer early on and make sure that you understand the legal implications. It's completely illegal to pay a surrogate in Canada. You need to know that. And there's no, people ask me all the time for hidden ways that people must do that. How do you get around it? There's no hidden way to pay a surrogate. It's illegal to pay a surrogate in Canada, but you are completely entitled to reimburse them for whatever it costs them throughout the pregnancy, throughout the surrogacy, in accordance with the regulations. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's also a legal parentage requirement that differs province by province. So even though we have a surrogacy agreement in place prior to the embryo transfer, if you're doing gestational surrogacy, or prior to the insemination, if we're doing traditional surrogacy, there's still a legal parentage process we must do after the baby's born, and that has to happen in every single province, although some provinces are easier than others, and we'll talk about that too. So the federal law is the same across the country, provincial law completely different province to province. In every single place in the country, a surrogate has to be at least 21 years or older. I'm not really talking about egg donation today. I'm not talking about sperm donation, but often I have clients who are doing both. So I'm just mentioning the donor has to be at least 18 years old. And the reason I'm talking about a surrogate has to be at least 21 years old is, for a lot of people, they think that's obvious. But really, people are so focused on the altruistic nature of surrogacy that they'll be like, well, my sister offered to be my surrogate. And then we start looking into this a little bit more, and we find out she's only 20 years old. You can't even talk to her about surrogacy until someone's 21 years old. You can't even induce them, encourage them, anything them about being a surrogate in Canada. Illegal, punishable by 10 years in jail, under $500,000. The question of who's a parent, totally different province by province. The question of if there has to be a genetic connection between the parents and the child when a child's born through surrogacy to make them the parents, that's different province by province. How long that parentage process takes, different province by province. So the law that you're probably most familiar with is can't pay a surrogate, offer to pay a surrogate, or advertise that will be paid. Again, can't induce someone or counsel someone to be a surrogate, believing they're 21 years of age or younger. And here's the part that is probably, I think, maybe the worst law in the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. It says that you can't accept consideration or pay consideration to a person to arrange the services of a surrogate mother. And that's really unclear what that means. And it's from there that people think you can't pay a surrogacy agency. And really, there's no good definitions provided in the Act. So it doesn't provide any definitions. But we know that there's lots of surrogacy agencies that exist that we don't think you're actually paying them to arrange for the services of a surrogate mother. You're paying them for other things. And if that's the case, that's legitimate. So we can talk about, talk to your lawyer, whichever lawyer you choose to work with, talk to them before you go forward with them to make sure you're doing things legitimately. A breach of Section 6 of the Act is punishable by 10 years in jail, under $500,000. No parents have ever been charged so far, but you know, it could happen. And I actually think that Health Canada is being a lot more stringent when it comes to the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. So I would be careful. I really recommend people be careful. Now, Section 12 is what let us know that although we can't pay a surrogate, we are allowed to reimburse her for her expenses. The thing is, if she misses work during the pregnancy, you can only reimburse her for her net lost wages if a doctor or a qualified medical practitioner certifies in writing that continuing to work may pose a risk to her health or that of the embryo or fetus. If you don't have such a letter in writing, you aren't allowed to reimburse her for her net lost wages. So in June this past year, Health Canada gave us regulations to the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, and they list what we're allowed to reimburse a surrogate. So whereas before we had the way I did it, the way a different lawyer did it, and the way a different lawyer than that did it too, they might not have been exactly the same. Now we have headings, and we know that as long as it fits into this heading, as long as there's a receipt, as long as all the qualifications and requirements regarding reimbursement are met, you can reimburse for all of these headings. So a surrogate's travel, her counseling, and counseling could be psychological counseling, can be legal counseling, can be genetical counseling, dependent care, products or services recommended in writing by healthcare provider. So this is a big deal. It used to be that we would say, you know, you can go get prenatal massage because that's obviously related to the pregnancy, etc. Now you need to get a doctor to certify in writing that it is recommended to get this. And that maybe doesn't sound like such a big deal. In actual fact, it can be a really big pain for people to try to get a doctor's letter for absolutely everything and every service or product they want to be reimbursed for. It's actually quite significant. You can cover maternity clothes, insurance, net lost wages during a pregnancy if a doctor certifies in writing that you must miss work to protect health of the surrogate or the fetus. But something that was missing in the regulations are net lost wages in the postpartum phase. And this was really upsetting to me and to a lot of other people involved in the surrogacy world, because of course, if someone gives birth, they need time after they've given birth to recuperate before they go back to work. And the entire purpose of the Assisted Human Reproduction Act is to protect women and children, or that's the stated purpose. And if that's the purpose, how are we protecting them by forcing them to go back to work immediately after they've given birth? So what happened is Health Canada then provided a guidance document, which doesn't have the force of law, but is really something we can rely on in terms of respecting that these are the people who wrote the regulations, and what do they have to say about the law? And their interpretation of the law is that even though it's not listed in the regulations, they don't believe reimbursing a surrogate for net lost wages in the postpartum phase is a breach of Section 6 of the Act, so feel free to do so, but I would recommend getting a lawyer and a doctor's note that she needs to miss work, even though that seems obvious. I still think it's a good idea. Now, really quickly again, legal parentage varies province by province. Even though you have this agreement in place prior to the embryo transfer or prior to insemination, you still have to go through the process after the baby's born. I get a lot of questions about, well, why can't I do this during the pregnancy? Why can't I get a pre-birth order the way you can in certain states in the United States? We don't have anything like that in Canada. So this is only a post-birth order you can get. Some provinces are better than others. The best provinces in Canada for surrogacy are Ontario and British Columbia. They have the best statutes and the best case law. So in both of those provinces, you don't need to get a court order. You can just get a birth registration. No need for DNA testing. No parent has to have a genetic connection to the child to make them a parent through surrogacy. Non-heteronormative laws. And they recognize multi-parent families. So you can have 3 parents, 4 parents be parents through surrogacy as well. Those provinces, I think, are the most ideal for surrogacy in Canada, but there's lots of other good provinces too where you can do surrogacy, and those include Nova Scotia, Alberta, New Brunswick, etc. You can actually do surrogacy almost completely across the country, but there are some concerns in some provinces. So for example, like I was mentioning before, Ontario and British Columbia are your best. Quebec is still majorly problematic. There are people who engage in surrogacy within Quebec, because we've never had a surrogate in Canada try to keep a baby, so they feel comfortable. But the truth of the matter is, if a surrogate in Quebec tried to keep a baby, she would be successful. That's the only place in Canada where I'm quite confident saying she would be successful. Other places, I don't think they are likely to be successful. There's also questions about Prince Edward Island because it's really hard to deal with. And Manitoba, it really depends. I'm not going to go into detail now, but it depends on the situation of the surrogate, if it's a good idea or not. All this to say, you need to speak to your lawyer early on before you go down a path and you realize, well, I just chose a surrogate in Quebec. She lives, in Eastern Quebec. There's no way she's giving birth in Ontario. What does that mean for the legal parentage of this child? You need to be aware of that prior to starting your surrogacy journey. Now, back to the tips. So this is where the focus of my presentation is going to be, on these tips. And these are just tips I have from doing surrogacy for completely exclusively, really. I just do fertility law all day for about 10 years at this point. So tip number 3 is trust your team. So you are going to choose the very best team you can have. And your team, you're not necessarily going to go who ranks the highest on Facebook groups. You're not going to go necessarily by, your agency tells you to work with this person because they have a good business relationship with them. You're going to go with who you click with and who you trust and who really is reputable. Go with the best doctor you can find, best lawyer, best counselor, best consultant you can find. But once you choose to go with them, you need to trust them. And all of these experts bring to the table lots of experience. So for example, instead of trying to really tell your surrogate what she's allowed to do, what she's not allowed to do, better to rely on what does the doctor say you can do, what does the doctor say you can't do, and rely on their expertise. Trust them. Trust your lawyer. They've been around the block many, many times. They know when something should have red flags. They know when something should be worrisome. Same with your counselor. And your consultant probably has been around the block many times. So really listen to what they have to say. And if there's something to be worried about, listen to them too. Now, something that I feel strongly about is seeing a fertility counselor. It's important to me that all of my clients involved in surrogacy see a fertility counselor, even if they're just doing at-home inseminations and there's no legal requirement for it or anything like that. But the difference that it makes in the process, I think, is really, really important. And this isn't about deciding if someone could be a parent. There's none of that. That's not what this is about. This is about 2 things. It's about some clients who've gone through a lot of trauma dealing with losses through fertility. or just had a really, honestly, a roller coaster ride, and rightly so, and I totally understand why, but they're not in the greatest place to be able to support a surrogate. And until you get into that place where you can emotionally support someone else's journey who's doing it for you, you're causing a lot of difficulty to the journey, and it's not going to be as successful as it could be. And then the other piece is psychoeducational. So as much as, you know, you might feel perfectly fine about using a surrogate, and hopefully you do, and you see it as a blessing that it is, there's a psychoeducational piece that's really important that only a fertility counselor can provide. So you might already be going to see someone for depression, someone for anxiety, someone for any issues you might have, and that person could be great, but unless they have experience in third-party reproduction, I want you to seek out someone who has that specific experience. We have quite a number of counselors that are involved with Fertility Matters Canada, so if you don't have one already, feel free to reach out to the organization and we can hook you up with someone who has lots of experience that we trust. Now, how to find a surrogate? This is probably the most often asked question for me. And there's really three ways. The first is friends and family. So not everybody's so lucky to have a friend or a family member who can be a surrogate for them. But if you are, it's a serious blessing. You'll trust the person probably a lot. It will save you a lot of money. There's a lot of benefits of working with friends or family through surrogacy. You already know them well. You probably know their lifestyle, their choices, etc. I've had some clients be very successful posting things online, and there are certain online groups you can engage in Facebook, for example, where you can find a surrogate online. And then there's sometimes people online actually just put up something on their own Facebook page and say, look, this is our situation. We're looking for a surrogate. You cannot offer to pay, so don't put that up. But they tell their story, and I've had clients be very successful doing that. I will say it's harder to find a surrogate online nowadays than it was a couple of years ago, but I don't think it's impossible. You do have to be somewhat thick-skinned and able to ride those waves. Also, you have to have a really good head on your shoulders and not just get too excited about the first person who offers, but really be able to see very clearly. But it is possible. And a lot of people use consultants in Canada. Again, I'm just taking that back to the beginning. There's legal issues with it, so speak to your lawyer first to make sure it's a reputable and legitimate consultancy. But if they are, they can be really, really helpful. So that's another option too. Now, who chooses to be a surrogate in Canada? There is empirical evidence at this point that most are Caucasian, Christian, early 20s to early 30s. Generally, surrogates in Canada are not poor. They might have modest but not low family incomes and relatively stable financial situations, and none are on social assistance. Women of color are greatly underrepresented, although I have to say in the past few years, I've been seeing more women of color be surrogates. And anecdotally, in my experience is very consistent with the research. Generally, what I see are people who are in what I would call helping professions, or stay-at-home moms, so nurses, doulas, personal support workers, teachers, midwives. So I see a lot of those kind of women choosing to be surrogates. And I see a lot of women who feel really good about being a surrogate. It gives them a sense of who they are, that they're someone who helps other people. And often my clients who are surrogates do it again and again because they feel so fulfilled by the process. So this is probably my biggest tip that I would recommend you do. The most important tip I can give you is put yourself in the surrogate's shoes. And put another way, it's appreciate the surrogate, but I think the way to get there is by putting yourself in her shoes. At the end of the day, if you're doing surrogacy in Canada properly, she's not walking away with $30,000 in her pocket. It's just not happening. So why is she doing this? And think about why she's doing this and what she wants from it. So really, in my opinion, not every woman is the same, but many of the women that I deal with who are surrogates, they want to feel really good about what they're doing. They want to be appreciated. They want to be valued. They think they're doing something incredible for someone else, and they are. They really, truly are. So let her feel that. Think about what's difficult for her. What can you do to support her? What's important to her in this process? How can you be there for her without invading her privacy, without, bothering her, but actually supporting her and appreciating her. So tip number 7 is that communication is key. We are going to draft a surrogacy agreement between the intended parents and the surrogates, but ideally you'll have discussed all these things discussed all these things before we actually do the drafting. So we want to know how many embryos per transfer, how many transfers, is there timing limitation? So for example, can the surrogate not do a transfer for a number of months because she's still nursing a baby, or does she need to do it within a certain few months because after that she has something else planned in her life? During the pregnancy, we want to think about things like abortion and selective reduction. And I would say that's, number one. You've got to make sure you and the surrogate see eye to eye on this, because there's very little we can do legally to protect you with that. Once the fetus is in her body, it's really her body. She gets to say what's going to happen. So you want to negotiate early on. How do we feel about abortion, selective reduction, amniocentesis, screening, other kinds of screening? Who's going to be there for labor and delivery, and where is this labor and delivery going to happen? Confidentiality, does it bother you if she writes a blog? Does it bother you if she writes in a forum or on Facebook, etc.? Are there limitations on that? Relationship is something that really needs to be discussed. So some surrogates really want a close relationship with intended parents, and those are generally my favorite types of surrogacies because I'm cheesy like that. I really love seeing people come together to build a family. But the people, it's not something that I can stick in an agreement and make happen, but that's something that you need to talk about early on to make sure everyone feels fulfilled and no one's disappointed. It has different expectations and aren't going to be met. And a lot of times people want to know about future contact. So when all this is over and we've had a baby, are we still going to be in touch with each other? Now, another tip I have for you is don't forget the surrogate's partner. People seem to forget this person, but this person is going to be very influential on the surrogate, and she is going to need his support or her support. Okay, so we want to know, how does this person feel about their partner being a surrogate? What are they concerned about? Often they're concerned for the well-being of their children, or that if the surrogate's on bed rest, for example, everything's going to fall into their shoulders. So how can we support them too? And how can we alleviate their concerns? So big hint here is don't forget about alleviating the partner's concerns as well. Now, my second last tip is don't rush it. So one is, part of not rushing it is make sure this is the right surrogate. I know people talk all the time about that there's not enough surrogates compared to intended parents in Canada, and that's true, but I've yet to find intended parents who haven't found a surrogate. It just hasn't happened, and I've been doing this for 10 years. So I think you're going to find someone. If you're looking for a surrogate, please make sure this is the correct person that you can trust. Also, don't rush the legal process, because when you rush, you give into things that you wouldn't otherwise have given into, or you throw away things that you just throw aside, things that actually mean a lot to you, and you later can't go back on that. So you make sure you're actually comfortable with what you're signing, and putting things in a rush and trying to rush all your service providers too adds pressure and stress to an already stressful situation. Biology is stressful enough. IVF is stressful enough. You don't need to add stress to that. The last tip I give you, I have to give you a caveat for. So I'm going to tell you that I think when you're doing surrogacy, it's a great idea to screen your embryos, to do PGTA testing on your embryos. Don't take medical advice from me. I've been to medical school 0 days of my life. Okay, I've never been. So talk to your doctor. They will give you medical advice about that. But I can tell you from the legal perspective, once that embryo is a fetus and in someone else's body, you lose a lot of control. So you lose control over the screening, you lose control over termination, if that's something you would be interested in doing or not interested in doing. So by screening the embryos, you take back some of the control if you're only going to transfer euploid embryos. So I think that really gives people a lot more confidence, and it makes it a lot less scary for them, and it keeps the intended parents having a little bit more control over the situation than they would otherwise. So that would be my last tip. So this is my email address. Feel free to write me with any questions you may have. I'm giving you my phone number too, but I'm much, much better to be reached by email. And if there's anything else I can do for you, let me know.
Sara, thank you.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. I've seen you talk about this on multiple occasions. This was so informative, and I found that the way you laid it out with these tips made it really clear to understand and kind of actually wrap your head around some of these considerations that are really important that may not have crossed your mind. So thank you for laying it out so well for us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So I'd like to touch on some of those
Sure.
as we, to kind of kick things off, I guess. So one that's come in is international surrogacy legal?
So I'm not sure if the author of the question means surrogacy from intended parents that are international coming into Canada or Canadians going abroad. So both are international surrogacy, and both of them have relatively complicated answers. So there's nothing illegal about having international intended parents come and do surrogacy in Canada, and it happens all the time. As long as there's a proper insurance in place, it's okay. Um, the other way, there's only a small caveat. Nothing can stop a Canadian from going abroad for surrogacy. You have to worry about things like citizenship, you have to worry about healthcare, all those things. But the question about paying a surrogate, if you make that payment from Canada using a Canadian financial institution, and you pay someone in the United States or pay someone in Cambodia or wherever it is, Greece, wherever it is you're paying the person from, but you make the payment from Canada, it's still potentially under Canadian law. So you really don't want to make payments to a surrogate or to someone arranging the services of a surrogate mother from Canada using Canadian financial institution.
Okay, that's very helpful, because I'm sure that's something where people might not consider that illegal if they were paying someone in another country.
Right, but we know that the law in Canada isn't about you can't do surrogacy abroad. It's just simply you can't pay a surrogate. And if you're paying from Canada using Canadian financial institution, you're breaking Canadian law.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that for us. Another question that's come in, would you recommend making embryos in advance of finding a surrogate?
So it used to be, 10 years ago, I would see a lot of people do fresh cycles with the surrogate, and now I almost never see it. I think, again, talk to your doctor, make sure that they believe that a frozen embryo transfer is the way to go. But in terms of the getting everyone ready, lining up all your ducks, not having to stress about different cycles at different times, and making sure that all works out, it makes life a lot easier using frozen embryos. So I also think you never know how successful your cycle is going to be. So it's nice. So sometimes there may be other issues related to this. Sometimes creating enough embryos for future transfers is a really good idea.
Okay. And it's just sort of, this is in addition to this isn't one that's come in, but just one that's a question that's popped into my mind. If you needed to use a donor, a donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryo, how does that process work? Would those come from your surrogate? The egg, I guess, would that come from your surrogate? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So many of my clients use both an egg donor and a surrogate. Some people use donor egg, donor sperm, and surrogate. Generally, we don't use the same egg donor as a surrogate. If we did, that would be a traditional surrogacy. And traditional surrogacy is generally much easier achieved through just insemination as opposed to IVF. But there are exceptions, and sometimes people do it the way you've just mentioned. Most of the time, we have an egg donor who's a separate person from the surrogate, and we don't try to line up anymore. And, I haven't seen that done in years when we try to line up the egg donor cycle with the surrogate cycle. I haven't seen that happen in years. It's can be complicated. You're relying on a lot of people and a lot of success. But yeah, you can do egg donor and a surrogate at the same time. You can do egg donor and sperm donor and a surrogate. But if there's no genetic connection to the intended parents, then the only place the baby can be born and the parents be recognized as the parents by just going through a simple court process or just going on the birth certificate is Ontario and British Columbia. So if you are moving to a situation where there's no genetic connection between the parents and the embryo, you need to talk to a lawyer and make sure the baby's going to be born in a jurisdiction that recognizes their parentage.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
No problem.
Another couple of questions here. Hi, Sarah. I'm wondering if you can talk about timelines. How long does it take to find a surrogate in your experience?
Sure.
And then how long would it take to draft a legal agreement?
Sure. So Sorry, I saw another person's question just came up and I got distracted for a second. So how long it takes to find a surrogate, it really depends. I'm guessing from the way that question was asked that we're talking about through a consultancy. And different consultants are going to tell you different numbers. I think COVID has slowed things down, to be honest. And I think whereas before COVID, I would have said, like 8 months, I think we're right now looking at more like 12 months is basically what we're looking at. There are some for sure that are faster and there are some that are slower, and your lawyer can go through with you different options. There's also some agencies that that just operate completely differently, that are more like an online forum and you find each other, and that can be either very fast or very slow. So it's worth going through with your lawyer, get a free consultation with them, and go through what your options are so you can understand potential timelines depending on the option you choose. I would say the drafting, again, it varies, but I think most of my files, the entire legal process is about 3 weeks. Okay. So are there longer?
Did you say 3 weeks or 3 months? I missed that.
3 weeks. Okay. 3 weeks. I think it really depends, like in the sense that sometimes you have intended parents who are very slow in terms of just reading a 40-page document. It's a long document. Sometimes you have the lawyer on the other side is just really caught up with something, or sometimes the negotiations are really, really surprisingly demanding. But I would say most files you're looking at about a 3-week turnaround.
Okay. And would the intended parents and the surrogate use the same lawyer, or would they have separate lawyers?
So the way it works is the intended parents are going to have one lawyer, and that lawyer is going to draft their document for them. And that agreement is going to be about 40 pages long, about there, give or take, depending on your lawyer, depending on what's included in it. And then the parents and their lawyer are going to review the document together. They'll revise it until they're satisfied. Then it goes to the lawyer for the surrogate. And the lawyer for the surrogate has to be a completely separate person, cannot work for the same firm. And that lawyer is going to take the document that was drafted by the other lawyer, review it with their client, negotiate it on their behalf, and then it goes back to the first lawyer. And we negotiate anything that wasn't agreed on, or you accept the changes if they're all reasonable and acceptable to everyone. Once everyone agrees, then we all sign, then the lawyers draft a letter and send it to the clinic that the agreement's in place. That goes to the clinic, and then the clinic will start doing the embryo transfer. So that's the entire process, I said, is generally about 3 weeks. So it really, again, there are exceptions to that, but I would say for the most part, that's what we see.
Okay. How many counseling sessions does it typically, is there a required number of counseling sessions, or is that?
So it's actually, I think there's a misunderstanding that you are legally required to see a counselor. There is no legal requirement at this point under the Assisted Human Reproduction Act to have a counselor. I just think it is absolutely necessary. And I put it in all my retainers that my clients agree to do this. Regardless of what process they choose, regardless of if the clinic requires it, I think it's really, really important, and people gain so much from it. It depends on the counselor how they do it. I see a lot of counselors do one session with the intended parents, one session with the surrogate, and one session altogether. Some people just do one with the intended parents and one with the surrogate. So every counselor is different. Like I was saying before, Fertility Matters Canada has a list of counselors that we work with that, all are excellent, and that we'd be happy to provide some names if people are looking for someone.
Absolutely. We definitely do. So if you're looking for a reproductive counselor to speak to help you along this journey, please reach out to us and we can recommend a number of counselors who are very good at this and would be great to work with. Should a discussion about abortion and selective reduction occur before pregnancy? And I think you touched on that, and I think you said that you would.
Definitely would. I even want that discussed before we draft the agreement. So it's something that my slide might have been confusing because I meant that's an issue that occurs during the pregnancy, but gotcha. All of that should be discussed even before you're having your lawyers draft the agreement. You don't want to go anywhere with a surrogate if you guys really cannot see eye to eye on issues about termination, because I can draft whatever agreement you ask me to and say, we all agree that if a fetus has Down syndrome, we're going to terminate, but if a surrogate changes her mind, there's nothing you can do about it. This is her body, it's her right, and you have to be aware of that. So you want to make sure that everyone sees eye to eye, that we understand each other, that we're all headed the same way and in the same direction. before you even get drafting an agreement with a surrogate.
Perfect. Great. Has anyone ever been charged with paying a surrogate?
So no parents have been charged with paying a surrogate. We did have one agency charged a long time ago, but no parents have ever been charged with paying a surrogate or paying a donor. I still think it's really important to follow the law. The potential penalty is 10 years in jail, or up to 10 years in jail, and or a $500,000 fine. We know that Health Canada has hired people to basically enforce the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. I don't know if they mean this part of the Assisted Human Reproduction Act or other issues under it, but now that they have people in place specifically to enforce, I think it behooves us to be even more careful than we were before.
Absolutely.
Although I do have to say, I think there's this misunderstanding that a lot of people are paying surrogates. My impression is that people are really careful with the law.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Do you find that, so these people that have been put in place with Health Canada, that's newer since the new regulations came out, or?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
The people that Health Canada has hired to enforce, those are new? They haven't been around for a long time?
My understanding is they're new, as this was
Okay.
a new thing that happened before, just prior to the regulations coming into force.
Okay. So how, I can imagine that for intended parents especially, that the legal implications, do you find that that's something that makes intended parents nervous? What's the general feel about the laws in Canada for intended parents and or surrogates?
So I definitely think the laws make the parents nervous. I wish I weren't, but I'm sure I'm the least favorite part of the process for a lot of the intended parents because I'm the no fun part. So certain of the laws in Canada are really beautiful. So for example, Canada's really LGBT friendly across the board, and that's great. Ontario and British Columbia are non-heteronormative. They're not even stuck to the idea that there can only be two parents. So the parentage laws in some provinces, particularly Ontario and British Columbia, not really anywhere else yet, those laws are great and something to be really proud of. The Assisted Human Reproduction Act, which is the federal law, in my opinion, it's a mess and needs to be scrapped and started from the beginning. Most intended parents that I speak with agree with me on that idea. Once in a while, you meet someone who only believes in the idea of altruism, but the way it works out, I don't actually think, I think for the people on the ground, I've yet to meet someone who's really involved on the ground with surrogacy who anymore believes that this kind of experiment we've conducted in Canada has been successful.
Okay. I feel from the patient perspective that would be, or I guess the intent, who is the patient? I'm saying that actually, but who, do we use that term, and who becomes the
so
patient
the
in
intended
this?
parents are the patient, but so is the surrogate.
Okay.
So when we're talking about the surrogate goes through the entire process, the entire pregnancy, getting pregnant, and everything that leads up to getting pregnant. So she's also a patient of the doctor, and they have to worry about her best interests as well.
Okay. So if someone is preparing for surrogacy, considering surrogacy, let's say gestational, what are the costs that someone can sort of consider budgeting for? How would someone put together a budget like this?
So there's a big range, which is the worst answer I can give you because I know you just want a number, and I'm sorry I can't give you an exact number. First of all, it depends in the sense, like, do you already have embryos? Are we including the cost of making the embryos? Are you in Ontario where the embryo cycle is, the creating of that embryos was funded, that IVF cycle? So that really affects the cost. So it's easier if I give you headings about what you have to budget for than if I give you numbers. So creating your embryos is a huge cost. Obviously, everyone who's gone through IVF knows that. So making your embryos. If you're going to work with a consultant, that's a really big cost. Some people choose to work with a consultant, and you could be paying, $10,000, $17,000, depending on the consultancy. Some people find a surrogate on their own, and then obviously they don't have that cost. Reimbursing a surrogate, what I typically see is about $25,000 as a maximum in Canada. Everyone needs to remember when you're reimbursing a surrogate, it's not that if say I have an agreement that says a maximum of $25,000, it doesn't mean she's entitled to $25,000. It means she's entitled to what she spends up until that point. Some surrogates are going to spend it and some surrogates aren't, and it depends on their situation. You know, how many transfers does it take? How easy is the pregnancy? How much help does she need, etc. So include that. Your legal fees are going to be probably for doing the surrogacy agreement and the independent legal advice for the surrogacy agreement, about $4,500 plus HST for both sides. And then the legal parentage depends on the province where the baby's born. In Ontario, if you're just doing the birth registration, it's very cheap. You're probably looking at around $2,000 or so. If you're doing it in Alberta, for example, where you have to get a court order, you're probably looking at around $5,000 plus tax or so. So there's a big difference in prices there. Of course, there's also lots of other expenses you have to think about. So you're paying the counselor. What if you're flying a surrogate in and out of the city where you're doing the transfer? What if she's on bed rest? So bed rest is a big potential expense. And bed rest is if the surrogate must miss work to protect her health or the health of the fetus, as certified by a doctor in writing, you could be covering her net lost wages. And if she doesn't have insurance or doesn't have employment insurance, that could be expensive. So there's it's worth sitting through with your lawyer early on and talking about all the potential costs. But I can't give you a single answer because I've definitely seen people do surrogacy for like as low as like $40,000, but I've also seen people spend $100,000 for sure.
Okay, thank you for that. I can imagine that that's a big piece, and sometimes, if you're budgeting, making babies is not inexpensive for those of us who are needing to use assisted reproductive technology. So that's a great help, and I'm really happy that your lawyer can help sort of earmark those numbers for you. Has a surrogate ever kept a baby? How is that protected?
So we're very fortunate. In Canada, we have never had a surrogate try to keep a baby. Okay, it hasn't happened. And thank goodness it hasn't happened. There are some provinces where the laws are stronger than others. So the strongest laws are going to be in Ontario and British Columbia. Those have really strong laws. Alberta's are also really strong, perhaps not as good as Ontario and British Columbia's, but coming up on a close second. And then at the other end of that spectrum, you've got Quebec, where Quebec's law actually says that a surrogacy agreement is null and void. So if a surrogate wanted to keep a baby in Quebec, I think she would be successful in keeping the baby. If a surrogate wanted to keep a baby in Ontario, I think it's unlikely she'd be successful, but we couldn't guarantee it because we've never had a surrogate try to keep a baby before. So we don't have, case law we can look back on and say that it's impossible.
Okay, so how does that work if you're a couple in Quebec or an individual who needs to use surrogacy or chooses to use surrogacy? Do they choose to do surrogacy in Quebec, or would they find a surrogate in another province? How do they navigate that?
So most of my clients who are in Quebec, I've noticed they generally tend to do surrogacy in Ontario and have the baby born in Ontario. Sometimes they'll have a surrogate who lives in Quebec, who lives right on the border of Quebec and Ontario, and then it's really easy. They can take the Quebec surrogate, give birth in Ottawa, for example, and it's okay. Right. But there are sometimes people just say, look, I've got my friend or someone I found or a colleague of mine in Quebec, and she's offered to be a surrogate, and they just take that chance. And we've been lucky, we've been successful in Canada where surrogates haven't kept a baby, but it's a risk people take if they do surrogacy.
Okay. So if the baby's born in a province outside of Quebec, those rules for keeping the baby would not be, if the surrogate lived in Quebec but had the baby in Ontario. Is that what you're saying?
So we would make Ontario law apply.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that.
No, that's a great question, actually. It's conflict of laws.
I'm always curious about that. So it sounds like we do have some work to do in this country provincially on parentage and how provinces help families grow and have their families. So Ontario and British Columbia, thank you for helping families, leading the way, because that's so important. And something that, probably lots of people who aren't needing to use surrogacy, or probably a same-sex couple, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if a same-sex couple has a baby in a province, they have to adopt a child. One of the partners sometimes has to adopt the child. Is that correct?
So that often happens in Quebec, but it very rarely happens anywhere else anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, the other provinces are much better at doing declarations of parentage. In
Okay.
Ontario and British Columbia, you don't even have to go through that step. You can simply register the birth if you've done the other steps, getting the agreements in place, having 2 lawyers, etc. If you've done that properly, you can just do a birth registration, which is even
Oh,
faster.
that's amazing. Awesome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think, I'm just going to check over on Facebook to see if any other questions have come in. Do you have anything that you'd like to add sort of as we've been going through?
No, but this was really fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was very informative. Like I said, you've educated me so much over the years, and again today I've learned something else. So thank you for laying it out so clearly. Thank you for all of you who have joined us on Zoom and on Facebook. Please check for this recording on our YouTube channel within the week or so. Oh, I have one more question that's come in. If we can take a question. Oh, it's more of a comment. Very important to consult the lawyer before, because this person is a NICU nurse and that remembers a case where a child was born with Down syndrome and there was no agreement in place. So.
My gosh.
Great. Yeah. So thank you for this. Thank you for reminding everybody that connecting with a lawyer in Canada and that you can get your consultation for free to make sure that you're starting this journey on the right foot with the information to make informed decisions. So you feel very comfortable and confident as you sort of go through the journey.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in on behalf of the Board of Directors of Fertility Matters Canada. We hope that you enjoyed this information session, and we'll see you again next week for another Figuring Out Fertility series. Thank you so much for your time, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.